Hello, dear listeners. Settle in, unwind, and let the ordinary fade away. Tonight, we have a tale that will linger in your thoughts long after it ends. So get cozy, take a deep breath, and remember, sometimes the creak in the floorboards isn't just your imagination. Let's begin. The Ghostly Hitchhiker with a Hidden Agenda. The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the thick fog of a moonless night. Mark Carter gripped the steering wheel, his fingers stiff from the cold seeping into his old sedan. The only sound were the rhythmic hum of his tires and the distant whisper of the wind snaking through the skeletal trees lining the highway. He wasn't supposed to be out this late, but after a long business trip and drinks at a bar, he'd lost track of time. The back roads were desolate, winding through an isolated stretch of land with no streetlights and no signs of civilization, just miles of shadows. As Mark rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught a figure standing on the side of the road. A young woman, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, waved frantically for him to stop. She wore a tattered dress soaked through, and her eyes were wide with desperation. Against his better judgment, Mark pulled over. The door creaked as she slid into the passenger seat, shivering violently. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark cleared his throat. "Where are you headed?" She hesitated before responding. "Just a little further down the road." She introduced herself as Clara and explained that her car had broken down miles back on a dark country lane. She needed a ride to the nearest town, which was still 30 minutes away. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but there was something off about her demeanor, something Mark couldn't quite place. She smelled faintly of damp earth, like soil freshly turned over after a rainstorm. Her skin, pale under the dashboard light, looked almost translucent. Mark forced a chuckle, trying to break the eerie silence. "Not a great night to be broken down and out here all alone." She didn't respond, just stared ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. As they drove, Clara fell silent, staring out of the window at the passing trees. The atmosphere in the car grew heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Mark tried to make small talk, but Clara's responses were curt, almost robotic. Her presence began to feel less like companionship and more like a weight. Within moments, the temperature inside the car dropped. Mark shivered and turned up the heater, but the vents only pushed out ice-cold air. The woman didn't seem to mind. If anything, she seemed more at ease, exhaling slowly as if savoring the cold. A gnawing sensation of dread crept up his spine. He glanced at her again. She was smiling now, a small, unsettling smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Suddenly, the car radio crackled to life, though Mark was certain he had turned it off. Static filled the cabin, punctuated by faint whispers that seemed to echo from a great distance. Clara didn't react, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Turn left," she said suddenly. Clara abruptly instructed Mark to turn onto a narrow, unmarked road. The road was overgrown, barely visible, and the trees seemed to close in around them. The headlights illuminated a path that felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in this world. Mark frowned. "Left? That's not the way to town." Her head turned toward him in a slow, deliberate motion. "Please, just for a moment." Something in her voice compelled him. Despite his instincts warning him otherwise, he flicked on the turn signal and veered onto a smaller road, swallowed by towering trees. The deeper they drove, the denser the darkness became. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their contorted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. There was no wind, no crickets, and no sound at all. Mark's ears rang from the suffocating silence pressing in on him. The road narrowed, winding through the oppressive forest. His GPS had lost signal and his radio was dead. It was as if the outside world no longer existed. The woman exhaled, content. Almost there. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. The road suddenly opened to reveal a cluster of rotting, abandoned houses. Their windows were dark voids, doors hanging loose from rusted hinges. A warped sign at the entrance read, "Still Waters Fall, established 1893. This town wasn't on any map. As they drove closer, Mark glanced at Clara, only to find her seat empty. His heart pounded as the car skidded to a stop, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Clara was gone. The back seat where she had been just moments ago was empty. His mind raced. Had she been thrown out from the car? Panic surged through him as he flung open the door and stumbled into the cold night, scanning the dilapidated house, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. Mark's instinct screamed at him to leave, but an inexplicable force drew him toward the house. The front door creaked open on its own, revealing a darkness that seemed to pulse with hostility. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. The walls seemed to whisper voices overlapping in a furor of despair. Mark's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced like spectres. He called out for Clara, but the only reply was a faint echoing laugh. In the heart of the house, Mark found a photograph on the floor. It was of Clara, but the image was decades old, faded and yellowed. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Clara was no ordinary hitchhiker. She was a ghost, and she had lured him here for a reason. His pulse skittered, uneven and urgent. "I don't think I should be here," he said, his voice hoarse. The woman turned to him slowly, her eyes darker than the night. "But this is where I died," she whispered. The air turned to stone in his lungs, choking him with dread. The world around him warped, and his mind struggled to process her words. "Stillwater Falls burned down in 1974, she continued, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her dress. 17 people died that night, including me." He could hear his heartbeat, rapid and wild, but his body remained still, shackled in place. From the houses, shadows moved. They took shape like figures flickering in and out of existence. As Mark turned to leave, the air behind him crackled with an unnatural hum. He barely had time to react before Clara reappeared, her form convulsing, stuttering like a broken reel of film. Shadows clung to her edges, her presence flickering between existence and oblivion. Her eyes, once familiar, once human, were no longer dark, but cold, glassy, predatory. A slow, unnatural grin spread across her lips, something inhuman stretching beneath her skin. She revealed that she had chosen him specifically, that he was the key to freeing her from this place. But freedom came at a cost, one Mark wasn't willing to pay. The woman's expression changed, no longer timid, no longer helpless. "You were meant to come here," she murmured. "You belong here." Mark's blood turned to ice. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. His skin burned where she touched. He bolted for the door, but the house seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in. Clara's laughter echoed through the halls, growing louder with every step. He stumbled through the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until he finally burst out into the night. He reached his car, but the engine refused to turn over. The headlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him. Clara appeared in the rearview mirror, her face twisted into a grotesque smile. She whispered his name. Her voice was dripping with malice. The town's forgotten sacrifice. Stillwater Falls wasn't just a forgotten town. It was a prison of lost souls. Every 50 years, it needed another. The woman, she wasn't just a ghost. She was a harbinger, a guide for the next sacrifice. And now Mark was trapped. He twisted the key in the ignition. Nothing. "Please," he begged, "let me go." She only smiled. The whispers became screams. The shadows crept closer. Mark turned to face Clara, his fear giving way to anger. He demanded to know why she had chosen him and what she wanted. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of sorrow. She explained that she had been trapped in the house for decades, bound by a curse that could only be broken by someone pure of heart. Clara's true agenda was revealed. She needed Mark to take her place, to become the new guardian of the house. If he refused, she would be forced to wander the earth for eternity. But if he agreed, he would be trapped in a nightmare forever. Mark's mind raced, torn between self-preservation and compassion. He did the only thing he could. He ran. He threw open the door and bolted, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The woman didn't chase him. She didn't need to. The town itself seemed alive, shifting, twisting to trap him within its cursed borders. Branches tore at his clothes. The air thickened, suffocating him. Behind him, the voices grew louder. They were closing in. Just as Mark saw a break in the trees, she was there, standing in front of him. "You can't leave," she whispered, eyes hollow, voice dry like leaves in the wind. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Mark lunged forward. He didn't care if she wasn't real. He had to fight. But his hands passed through her. The moment his body touched hers, the world collapsed into darkness. In a moment of clarity, Mark realized that Clara's curse was not his burden to bear. He shouted that he would not be her pawn, and as if in response, the car roared to life. He sped away, the road disappearing in the rear-view mirror. Clara's anguished scream followed him, fading into the night. His hands were gripping the steering wheels, knuckles white. Mark returned home, but the experience left him scarred. He avoided driving at night, and the sound of static on the radio sent shivers down his spine. He often wondered if Clara had found another victim, or if she still waited on that lonely road, searching for someone to take her place. As for Mark, he never forgot Clara or the night she changed his life forever. He often wondered if he had made the right choice, if he could have done more to help her. But deep down, he knew that some roads were better left untraveled, and some doors are better left unopened. The Ghostly Hitchhiker remains a mystery, a haunting reminder that not all spirits seek peace. Some seek something far more sinister. I hope you enjoyed this story. Thank you so much for listening. If you do have any comments, leave them down below, and until the next time, have a good evening. Wherever you are in the world, take care.